Thank you to those who joined. We'll get started in just a minute as we let folks filter on. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited today to discuss the digital divide for marginalized communities, how COVID has exacerbated that divide, and most importantly, what policymakers can do to solve it. We have a fantastic panel lined up today. We have Lucas Peterzak, a policy associate at Next Century Cities. We have Angela Seifer, the executive director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Marita Coley, president and CEO of the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, as well as Zachary Ryan, who is the strategic legal advisor at the National Hispanic Media Coalition and the co-founder of Netiq Lab. So before we dive in, just a quick housekeeping measure. We're going to have a question and answer portion at the end of this webinar. So you can ask questions if you go to the question and answer section of Zoom at the bottom of the page. You should see two little squares that say Q&A, and that's where you can ask questions. Other administrative note, I tried to get my cat out of the way. Other panelists tried as well. We can't guarantee that there's not some fun friends visiting us. All right, so to get started, I wanted to start off by framing this conversation with why broadband is so absolutely essential today. Particularly during COVID. So as a lot of us on this webinar are doing, it enables us to work from home and learn from home, access telehealth, which is particularly important during COVID since so many people are trying to stay home and not get infected. It helps people apply for jobs, access government benefits. It helps small businesses sell their goods online so that they can compete. Lets people connect with their friends and family, even if they can't be physically near them. We can read the news online, watch TV, movies, listen to music. It's even needed. There was an article the other day about some of America's lowest income individuals need to have the internet in order to apply for their coronavirus stimulus checks. So the internet really is vital for every facet of life nowadays. Unfortunately, not everyone has access to broadband. And communities of color and low-income communities are particularly unlikely to be connected. I'm going to share some of these stats. They're staggering. 42 million people in this country don't have access to broadband. Independent research by Microsoft found that even amongst those that had internet access, as many as 157 million Americans didn't use the internet at broadband speeds. And that's a speed of 25.3. A lot of those who aren't connected right now are from marginalized communities. Almost 30% of households making under $30,000 a year, they don't have broadband at home. Black and Hispanic households are also less likely to have broadband at home. The Pew Research Center put out a study that said only 66% of African Americans and 61% of Hispanics report having broadband at home. And according to the Census Bureau, in the 111 largest cities in the US, African Americans and other people of color comprise 75% of the unconnected residents. So the problem is huge. And today we're going to talk about some ways that we can fix it. I wanted to give a note. So this webinar, it's called Digital Redlining. But what it's really about is the reasons that marginalized communities either don't have broadband at home or have lower quality broadband. So digital redlining has often been associated with online advertising that are keeping people of color from certain opportunities like housing. But the term can also refer to discrimination against residents of lower income urban neighborhoods where internet service providers don't invest as much in broadband infrastructure. It's not necessarily that these communities have no broadband, but that as a result of this discrimination, they often have lower quality service than higher income neighborhoods. Also, and this is, one of the key things that we're going to talk about today, a lot of marginalized communities don't have broadband access because they can't afford it. So all of these things kind of play into the lack of broadband connectivity amongst marginalized communities. And in order to actually fix the problem and ensure that broadband is deployed universally across the country, we need to make sure that every community has access to quality service and affordable rates. So our panel is going to discuss this in more detail, and I think we can get started. Can we start off, Angela? NDIA has published a lot of reports about specific instances of redlining. So can you talk a little bit more about digital redlining in the broadband context and share some examples of what's really happening out there?
Sure. Thanks for having us, Jenna. In the context of broadband, redlining is the lack of upgrades on networks. So in particular, NDIA found that AT&T was not upgrading the networks in low-income neighborhoods. We started out in Cleveland, and then we also did the same analysis in Detroit and Dayton and Dallas. And it's not our data, it's FCC data. So data the providers give to the FCC. And we looked at that and we overlaid it with poverty data. So when you do that, you can see which neighborhoods have faster DSL, slower DSL, fiber. And that's where we saw that the same neighborhoods that have low poverty, the same neighborhoods that haven't been upgraded. And so that's how we use the term digital redlining in this broadband context.
So what that raises for me as a next question is how, why, why are companies doing this? Dacre, can you tackle that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really important question. I think, logically, a lot of people go there next of how are these companies able to do this? And so, there's not like a law in the sense of how most people think of it, right? Like the No Redlining Act. But there is the Communications Act. And in the Communications Act, the FCC has the duty to ensure that internet service providers are deploying service in a way that's not discriminatory, and that universal service is being deployed to all people in the US. Unfortunately, that duty is not often exercised or enforced, particularly not under the Trump administration. But local and state governments also have the ability to fight against redlining by using their leverage in granting permits or right-of-ways. So in other words, these government bodies at the local and state level can require ISPs to deploy out to these unserved and underserved areas in exchange for the ability to build out on municipal lands and things like that.
Thanks, Zachary. I think another question that I'm guessing folks that are listening in on this webinar have is, why is the digital divide so much larger for communities of color and low-income communities than it is for others around the country? Even though there is a digital divide everywhere, it's really particularly notable here. I think Dacre, Marita, can either of you tackle why the digital divide impacts these communities? You're muted, Marita, if you're trying to talk.
Oh, thanks. I think it's not just digital, because I think that in practically any aspect of life where you're talking about, economic justice, or you're talking about health disparities, or you're talking about educational disparities, I think it's the same with broadband, and there are some correlations between, economic, health, literacy, and an adoption of broadband. And first, I want to clarify that most broadband, and we agreed to this before about when we were talking about redlining, most broadband is not deployed with that. That's not the intention. Just give a little history lesson. I've represented African-American owned cable systems over the years. And I think that what's happened, and this is my opinion, is that initially when broadband cable was deployed, there were franchises, and they were deployed pursuant to franchise agreements between the city, local franchising authority. And then later there became state, and there were agreements between the local authorities and the cable operator or provider as to what was going to be deployed, when it was going to be deployed, where it was going to be deployed, how it was going to be maintained. It was all done by agreements, franchising agreements. And then over the year, and the franchise agreements might be for 20 years, 10, 20 years. And then I think later on, as we've evolved, as broadband has evolved, some of the local franchising agreements and state franchising agreements, they were, what do you call it? The word I'm thinking of, deregulated, thank you. Deregulated. And so then you didn't have these constructs as to what was going to be deployed, when it was going to be deployed, and how it's going to be maintained. So I think that those are the kinds of things that can have an impact on low-income communities. And those are the things that I think as advocates, we have to be like a laser beam and focus in on those areas that are not, either being maintained or being upgraded or being left out. But that's not generally the intention when it starts.
Not the intent, but what winds up happening and still probably solved. Dr., do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing those points up, Marita. I think, when we talk about the digital divide, sometimes we talk about it in very siloed ways instead of talking about kind of the layers that are all interconnected. And so, at least from NHMC's perspective, the digital divide, the number one cause, right, is affordability. But when you kind of peel back that layer, you see that it's also deployment. And it has to do with the infrastructure. And it's sad, but the reality is that oftentimes our communities of color, we're just the last to get the infrastructure upgrades. And so, a lot of many low-income areas or vulnerable populations are actually still relying on wire copper lines. And so those are like the traditional landlines that we think of, right, when we think of like picking up the phone. Back in the old days. And there are a lot of benefits to copper, right? So that's a conversation for another day. But when copper lines are not well maintained, because say maybe a certain internet service provider wants to push that particular residential area into like a higher contract, a more expensive contract, those lines rot and service just gets worse and worse. And so that's one issue we see. But also kind of, in a different vein, we see this happening after natural disasters. So there's a pattern of internet service providers choosing who deserves an upgrade or restoration and who doesn't. So for example, after Hurricane Harvey, Texas and Florida had their wireline and their wireless services back up within days. But after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, that process took months. And it was really just for the wireless service. Right now, we still do not know how much wireline service was damaged on the island. And this hurricane happened almost 3 years ago. And there's really no data or inclination from the FCC or from the ISPs that they have committed to rebuilding it in a non-discriminatory way, or in a way that doesn't price out the people who live there and bought from them before the hurricane.
So Dr., you raised something that wasn't in our agenda, but I still think it's a point worth mentioning. We don't have data about the problem. We don't know how well networks are, going back up again after natural disasters, but we also don't have a lot of this data more generally. I guess this is an open question for the entire panel, but someone want to say how the lack of data is impacting communities of color and marginalized communities and really keeping them from getting connected, and what types of data maybe should be collected to try and fix it? I know this is something that public knowledge has focused on a lot, but I'm curious to hear the perspective of others.
I think the biggest piece of data that's not out there is the cost of internet. New America's OTI put out a report last week that's really helpful. But at the local level, folks don't generally know how much internet costs. And then it becomes an issue of understanding that it's really a barrier. Oh, do we know that it's a barrier in our area? Maybe it's a barrier someplace else. Being able to compare. state versus state, locality versus locality, how are we compared to others? So OTI's report is really helpful in that regard to see, oh, the US is really expensive compared to other countries, and to see how your state compares to other states.
And I was going to mention the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee has a working group that is specifically supposed to work on low income, the reasons why some low income areas aren't either deployed or adopting or whatever. And one of the things I think that, and it's kind of what Dacre said, we're looking at things in silos, and we really do have to look at them in terms of overall integration, because there are, for instance, a number of there's Lifeline programs, there's low income broadband programs, and the adoption rate might not be where it should be for a variety of reasons, because there are efforts out there to fix these pockets. But I think it's a matter of raising the awareness about it. And that goes with some of the other things that we've talked about today in terms of just systemic issues where some people are left out. The internet, to me, is a way to get more people connected. But if you're really, focused on trying to, make it every day, that may not be the most relevant thing in your life, especially if you don't see what the benefits are. So I think it has a combination of deployment, making sure that people have the best, first class speeds in internet, but also helping people to understand what you can actually do with the internet and how it can improve your condition. COVID is a great, I think, opportunity for all of us to really focus in like a laser beam on the communities that can really use the most help, because everybody had to go home. And some people didn't have it. Some kids, they were at school, they're okay at school, but then they go home and they don't really have the internet at home. And that was when the FCC, put together those Keep America Connected plans and had people try to come up with different strategies for, keeping people on, providing, open hotspots. But I think we have to look at all of these things together. The digital divide isn't a silo, it's part of a greater systemic issue that I think we have to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it is. I don't want to, Lucas, Zachary, do either of you have anything to say on the data question though, in like terms of data that would be really helpful for getting these communities connected? I want to give you a chance to answer that as well.
I think to sort of echo Angela's point and to something Dacre said earlier, without this explicit like federal redlining law, there really isn't an incentive to look for something and say, when we look historically at redlining with housing, there were explicit maps that you can look back historically and say they literally drew it out and said this neighborhood should not be invested in. And I think to Angela's point about trying to get the pricing data, even local officials that we work with at Next Century Cities are really struggling in their own communities to identify where the redlining is, because they don't have unlimited resources as a municipal government. And even they face barriers of people that they are in right-of-way partnerships with and trying to even figure out, what's in the ground in our locality and how much is being charged for it. So I think Angela's point is probably the most important, that, we have to find a reason for that data to be gathered and incentivize people sort of at every level, public and private, to want to gather it, because it isn't as explicit as redlining was in the 20th century.
Absolutely. And I think another piece of it, just kind of going back to this disaster recovery part, we don't really have data on network resiliency. And that's a huge problem, that kind of is cyclical into, what we're seeing in Puerto Rico and with wildfires.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like one thing that public knowledge has pushed for is data on how fast networks are bouncing back after a natural disaster. So like how long are outages for, how many people are they impacting? And this is something that's, I think, beneficial to all communities, and particularly folks in Puerto Rico and places that are seeing a lot of this. So I know I got us slightly off track, but I do think that data is absolutely 100% data on affordability, data on the quality of the networks, data on network resiliency is all things that are going to help us, understand this problem better so that we can close the digital divide. I think another thing, that public knowledge is interested in, and that I think has a lot of relevancy here. So people across the country, including communities of color, they don't have their choice of internet providers, right? Like, I think the stats are that 35% of Americans live in a market that only has one broadband provider. And another 37% live in a market that only has two providers. So people don't have their choice of providers. And, I'd be inclined to think that that has some sort of impact on marginalized communities and maybe impacts affordability. Lucas, I know Next Century Cities thinks about this issue. Can you share more about how that impacts communities and how that contributes to the digital divide here?
Definitely. I know something that we recognize when we have our conversations with municipal leaders is a lot of time they have seen competitors come and go, and they are able to sort of talk to their counterparts in other communities within their state, across the country. And they notice that in these other communities where a second provider naturally comes in, or even a third provider, that their prices are dropping. And suddenly the motivation to invest is there in network upgrades. The motivation to have good customer service is there, because suddenly they're recognizing, we aren't the only player in town. We have to stay competitive and have our edge over sort of these other ISPs. But something we recognized in low-income communities, even within one municipality, there may be a part of the community where prices are very low. And I know one of our members, Louisville, noticed this in Kentucky, that one part of their city was paying 15 cents a megabit per month, whereas another part of their city was paying $1.20 per megabit per month. And sort of a 700% difference between what two residents of the same municipality are paying was almost a direct result of, there was a motive to invest in this community. And sort of as these people wanted faster and faster speeds up to gigabit networks, they were edging out these lower income communities. And, they were being able to afford slower and slower speeds. And when Louisville finally incentivized a third provider to come into the community, they saw their prices drop across the municipality as a whole. And, we see municipalities do that with private providers. We see them lay middle mile backbone or their own open access networks that bring fiber or something to the home, all the way up to some of the networks that I know OTI recognized in their report, these fully run municipal networks that have basically come in and forced the competition and said, we are going to motivate you to invest in our residents because we're going to show you that, with our little bit of help, these other ISPs can show up. And it sort of is this free for all that ends up helping the consumer a lot at the end of the day.
So I love it. Like, communities are kind of empowering themselves to make broadband more affordable and have better customer service. That's a big one, guys. Like, when you're waiting on the line for 2 hours when you have a problem, no one has time for that. Those are some really incredible stats. And the follow-up question, there's a lot of states that they ban municipalities from having their own networks, right? Like, what is that doing to, the drive for more competition and how that's going to lower prices for folks?
Yeah, and anyone else can chime in. I think we're at 22 states right now, if I'm remembering that correctly, that either completely roadblock or put some significant barriers in front of municipalities, either having an open access network where they're leasing out wholesale fiber or having their own municipally run network. And we work a lot with those municipalities so they can try to figure out, what is an innovative solution, because it's very hard to look at a local leader and look at something like redlining and say, okay, it's your job to solve this, but we're taking away 5 options that are available to your counterparts in other states. And I know there's been work at the federal and the state level to try to get those barriers out of the way. Because, why are we going to ask someone to solve one of the most pressing problems of our age and say, but here are all of these really good solutions, but you can't touch any of them. You have to find something else.
Indeed. Why? Yeah, thanks, Lucas. Does anyone else need to chime in on that quickly?
I was just going to chime in and say, once again, and I feel like I'm dating myself because I, was involved in the early iteration of cable industry and deployment. But based on what Lewis is saying, some of what would help with that is to look at what were the reasons that the franchising laws were changed and deregulated, because initially there was a lot of cooperation between the local authorities and the provider, and perhaps that's something that we should look at both on the state level and on at the FCC's level, because in that way you're able to get that information as to where the areas that we can strategically target that need support, whether or not they need support in terms of deployment and upgrades and speeds, or whether the communities need support in terms of affordability. So I think that Lucas's point is very well taken in terms of if looking at why some of these laws were deregulated, and maybe look at it again and say, was that really appropriate? Did we go overboard? Do we need to be more strategic now? And identify where some of the problems are, because I do think it's an issue where we need surgery as opposed to a shotgun, because most of the things that we're all talking about have to do with communities that are 30 household income of $35,000 or less, or kids who are in homes that don't have broadband. A lot of it relates to income, and so maybe there are some things that we went overboard in terms of deregulating, and we need to look at some of the old constructs.
The movement to have state franchise agreements instead of local franchise agreements, the idea was that it would save money, because they wouldn't need, the cable providers wouldn't need to keep negotiating with all of those localities, which is time consuming, et cetera. But then I think the consequence that resulted, whether intentional or not, is that then those localities can't negotiate to make sure that they have everything they need. And another important point is that the redlining isn't occurring in the cable companies, it's occurring with the telecoms. Because at the point at which, cable is already laid, it's already everywhere. And it's the upgrades in the copper networks that's where we see the digital redlining.
Yeah. Angela, I want to keep it with you. Affordability is one reason why communities aren't connected, but that's not the only thing, right? Like, not having access to devices, not understanding how to use the internet or a computer, all of that's going to contribute.
Right, and they're actually like a bit meshed together. So when there's data that only asks one question, right? Why don't you use the internet? It can be misleading because it can be a mesh of things. It's expensive. I don't really know how to use it. Why would I pay for something that's expensive? That seems dumb, right? So we do need to make sure that we address that digital literacy piece of it. That's never going to end, because technology is going to keep changing. And all of us, we continuously struggle with it, right? Every day. And so if you're already feeling behind the curve, then it's really intimidating. And so NDIA very much promotes the idea that digital literacy training needs to come from trusted community entities where they already have the relationships. And so teaching someone digital literacy is based upon an existing relationship.
So if no one has anything else to add about the problem, I want to shift to talking about COVID. It's on everyone's minds constantly, all the time. Driving me insane, but I think we all can't wait till it's over. I think the reality is COVID, it's bad for everybody, but I think, it's really exacerbated the digital divide in terms of some people can do everything that the internet allows them to do. Some people can't. I've been actually working with a lot of tribal members on a separate issue, and some of them can't join conference calls and can't join meetings until they drive 2 hours outside of their home to get some internet. It's absolutely, horrible how the digital divide is impacting people. So I want to talk about COVID and how it's, particularly impacted communities of color, maybe disproportionately so. Anyone want to take that, Daiquiri? Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And so You're absolutely right. I mean, communities of color are definitely disproportionately affected by this pandemic. And so I actually put together some statistics about the Latinx community. I think sometimes we kind of get jumbled into the umbrella phrase of people of color, communities of color. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to throw some pandemic related Latinx statistics out. So we are more likely to feel economic or financial hardship during this time. 91% of Latinx owned small businesses have zero chance of receiving a PPP loan. Black and Latinx people are more likely to be frontline and or essential workers, which puts them at a higher risk of infection. And then Latinx people are 4 times more likely to be hospitalized with the coronavirus than white people. And so just to kind of I feel like some of these statistics feel very big. To take it a little bit more granular for DC, that's where I live. I know it's where a number of us live. Latinx people are 4 times more likely to die from the virus than white people in Virginia and Maryland, and 6 times more likely in DC, which makes us the most vulnerable and most at-risk demographic in the region. And that's obviously not unique to DC, right? That's a lot when we talk about cities with higher Latinx populations, like in other populations too, but in New York, Chicago, Phoenix, et cetera. And then to top that off, as if all of that depressing data is not enough, certain classes of immigrants, including people with DACA, are completely barred from all relief options right now. And that's an intentional thing, despite the fact that people with DACA in particular over-index as frontline and healthcare workers.
These stats make me, yes, that was very sad. And, goes back to like, yes, this problem is bigger than the digital divide completely, although we all work at, organizations that focus on tech stuff. So I guess to go back to the digital divide, I don't know, Marita or someone, you've seen like the Latinx community in particular has been really impacted by COVID. I'm guessing the African-American community has as well. I mean, we've seen some of that same data that, they are more likely to die and other things. But can you talk about how like some of the harms that Daiquiri talked about impact the ability to connect, like being, more likely to die, more likely to go into work and all of those things, how it impacts broadband adoption?
Yeah, I think that, I guess one theme that we're starting to develop from this panel is that the digital divide issue is just integrated with a lot of the other issues that impact vulnerable communities. Like Daiquiri said, that, people who are doing certain jobs, but they have to, go and they don't have the luxury. I figure we've got a couple hundred people on here. Probably nobody who's on this today has had any problems with their internet. They're, always connected. They don't have the issues that we're trying to address with some of the communities who either don't have access because they can't afford it, or who don't have access because they don't have the same, they're not able to get on Zoom and some of the other features because they don't have a high enough speed. And I think that it's all tied, the whole health disparities thing. When during COVID, you couldn't go to the hospital. So if you had to see your doctor, you had to do it on telehealth. But if you didn't have a broadband, connection at home, that was sufficient for you to, engage in, telehealth diagnosis and treatment, then that put you in that same category. But it is a combination, I think, of the deployment issues, the education issues, the affordability issues, and the literacy and proficiency, and even the knowledge about what's available. We're having a virtual job training, to help people who may have been laid off to try to connect with, how to get a job on the internet. And so I think that it's all of those things that impact, communities of color and vulnerable communities in general, in terms of having access to it, knowing what it can do, knowing how to use it, being literate and proficient. And those are things where I think it takes a village. It takes, the government being sensitive, state and local government being sensitive to what the needs are, and then being willing to do something about it.
One of the things you said that stuck out to me was it's an affordability thing. And I'm not sure, Daggery, if you got to this or not, but like we've seen studies that say that COVID is directly impacting the ability to pay for broadband, right? Like people are losing their jobs. They can't afford it anymore. I think there was a Morning Consult, they did a survey that showed this, and there's been other data too. Has anyone seen that? We could, suffice to say, we could just note it if there's nothing to add. But oh, Daiquiri, sorry.
No, I've seen one from Pew. You know, the exact statistic doesn't pop into my head, but definitely respondents of color were more likely to say they're worried about paying their broadband bills.
And that's to not be able to pay your broadband bill. Oh, sorry.
I think it's critical because, you know, the FCC had, you know, a number of 700 companies agree not to terminate your service during COVID. And then there were other, you know, things that carriers did, like opening up their hotspots and just doing really remarkable things that I think were great. But the reality is that it's not a forever solution. So, you know, I think the Keep Americans Connected pledge, it ran out June 30th. Some companies extended it in order to continue to help people to be connected, but we definitely need some long-term solutions to get people connected so that they never get cut off. So, you know, we can talk about that later, but we have some thoughts and ideas that we've been sharing, because I think it is important. All COVID does is reveal the weaknesses that already exist in the system, and it provides us with an opportunity to surgically address where those weaknesses are.
Thanks. One thing, you know, you talked a little bit about the Keep Americans Connected pledge. That's a bunch of internet service providers. They volunteered to not shut off service. I think they got rid of data caps as well. I'm gonna kind of combine two things here, but like Angela, Zachary, can either of you talk about things that providers or the FCC have done to deal with this problem in the short term, and how that's been working?
Yeah, sure. I think the most valuable things that providers did was offer the free 2 months, sometimes more, service. AT&T, Comcast, and Charter already had discount internet programs. Those programs are largely unknown by those who are eligible. Still today, people don't know they're eligible. The awareness of them is a serious problem. Comcast has done the most awareness of their program, such that we've seen very well-meaning people in non-Comcast areas recommending their folks sign up for Comcast Internet Essentials, which is pretty heartbreaking, because there might be something else, but the person who was well-meaning just didn't know that something else existed. So there's a real need to make those offers aware, make folks aware that those offers exist. They're not a solve-all solution. There's limited eligibility. There's some barriers such as debt with that company. So it's not a full solution, but it's still a valuable resource that we're not making the most of. On NDIA's website, digitalinclusion.org, right on the homepage, there's a free and low-cost internet. Like, click the link and it shows you what we know is out there. We keep that list up to date. And then after that, I think the Keep Americans Connected pledge, which was to keep, you know, folks from having their internet turned off, but that's ended. So there's this clear need of we need a longer-term, bigger solution. And the one that's on the table right now that's being discussed is a federal broadband subsidy.
Yeah, we'll talk about maybe that a little bit more in the solutions part. I think we absolutely should. Yeah, I think it's great. There's a lot of companies that are doing a lot of good, but maybe, you know, that's not enough to solve this problem. One other thing I just want to talk about quickly for COVID, and then I want to move on since we can make sure I'm seeing a ton of questions come in from folks that are attending this, which is great, and we want to get to them. So we'll try and speed things through a little bit, but this is probably a question for Lucas, but, you know, we've heard some stories of the internet not necessarily performing the same across the country. Has like the failure to invest in certain communities led them to have like worse service during COVID? Has that happened? Is that a thing?
Yeah. So Broadband Now has actually been doing a phenomenal job during the pandemic to sort of keep an eye on network performance. And I'm happy to share the link with all the attendees, but they have a number of reports they've put out since March, sort of about network degradation across the country. And sort of just doing like a high level bird's eye view of each of their reports. One thing that's really noticeable is, so they measure the amount of time that a network is performing outside of its normal range. And networks that perform, I think it's greater than 40% of the time outside of their normal range are sort of flagged by Broadband Now. And just doing a quick look at those communities, they almost across the board always had a lower per capita income, a higher poverty rate, oftentimes have a larger non-white population than the average American city. And so to the point earlier, we aren't really measuring network resiliency and sort of these upgrades in ensuring that our network can continue to perform both download and upload, because I know that's something we've talked about since March, is that we're putting a much heavier strain on upload with things like this webinar than we have previously. And some of the networks, such as New Orleans, for example, their regular range to be performing for upload speeds for the average household is 8 to 11 megabytes per second is their median range. And they've been performing more than 40% of the time below that range. So you're taking these networks that are already very far behind where they need to be in 2020, and you're sort of hurting these lower income communities and often communities of color a lot more, because you're saying, well, you have to telework, you have to do distance learning, you have to live online, but we're going to take a network that wasn't prepared for all of you to log on at once, and we're going to slash your speeds even further. And we're going to say best of luck to sort of figure it out now. And without the data and without, sort of the knowledge, like Angela was talking about, of these low income programs where you can get assistance, people are sort of left just wondering like, okay, my internet isn't working half the time. So what is their incentive to sort of seek out alternatives? And there isn't an incentive there unless we inform people of the options available.
Thanks. So solutions, let's talk about solutions. And I think we can break this down into, in the time we have left, short-term solutions and long-term solutions. Like, there's probably things that we should do right now during COVID to get people connected as soon as humanly possible that may or may not help connectivity in the long term. So, and I think we can just maybe go through all the panelists. Can you guys each give me like the best way that we can help get people connected during COVID as like a short-term thing? I'm going to ask you to keep it brief, but the top thing that you think that we can do, and we can start with Marita.
I'd like to actually give a shout out to Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago, who could, I think, use a shout to lifting up right now. She's doing a phenomenal job. And one thing that they did, and it's sort of a model that brings together all that we've been talking about today, but they have a public-private partnership that's a combination of the city that did this extensive research on who needed help. And what they came up with was that there were 100,000 students who in households, that students that didn't have broadband at home. And so they figured out exactly where they were on the south side and part of the north side of Chicago. And they put together this whole public-private partnership with philanthropists who put in money, and community-based organizations that put in enrolling people and raising awareness about this program. And then people like Barack and Michelle Obama contributed. So it was like an open program where they're getting 100,000 students who didn't have broadband, getting their homes on broadband with a combination of the city and private dollars. And also the adoption piece is critical because they have the CBOs coming in. They have, I think it's United Way is administering the payments. The payments go to the carriers. I think it's RCN and Comcast territory. So the United Way administers the payments, And then it starts immediately because it's addressing the issue where people aren't on, but there is availability, but there's not adoption. So there's the skills training and all. And sorry it took so long. But I think that's a perfect example that kind of merges all of the things that we're talking about today.
Can I follow up, Marita? The thing I would love to see is more of the providers beyond Comcast having that bulk purchasing at a reasonable rate. So far, they're the only ones I'm seeing. And T-Mobile. So who are all of the localities partnering with? Comcast, T-Mobile, somebody local. That's it. Where's everybody else?
Is that your top short-term solution, Angela?
That's it, right there.
Okay, Lucas.
Mine would probably be, I know at the beginning of all of this, they adjusted some of the E-rate rules, allowing libraries to pump their Wi-Fi out of their buildings. And I think taking a fine comb and looking at the tools that are already in communities at anchor institutions, and I know Shelby does a really good job of sort of highlighting those, and recognizing that, you know, a lot of these cities and towns and counties already have infrastructure for their city services. And oftentimes the internet is there. It's just a matter of, can they allow Wi-Fi from this school out to the neighborhood? And sort of unlocking more of these tools, such as a city that's escaping me right now, but they parked their Wi-Fi enabled school buses in the neighborhoods. And I know these are sort of stopgap solutions. You can't park a bus there forever, but making sure that there aren't barriers in the way for a school system or a city council or a county commission to say, we have these tools, let us use them for the general public. And I think oftentimes they're either misinformed at the municipal level and don't know that they have options available, or there's just too many sort of hoops to jump through for them to be allowed to do it.
Yeah, and you mentioned E-rate. For those on the webinar that aren't familiar with it, it's a FCC program that provides funding to schools and libraries to help with connectivity there. Daiquiri, what's your top short-term solution?
Yeah, so it was short term when we all started pushing forward in March, and it's almost August, so I'll see how short term that is. But for an HMC, the biggest way to close the digital divide and all of these like COVID related things that we're seeing is an emergency broadband benefit at the federal level. To have some sort of benefit or voucher program that can get connectivity to people as soon as possible. We've endorsed a couple of different versions, and that's really what we're looking towards right now. Hopefully a short term, but you know, Lord knows it could take a long term.
And I'm going to answer this question too, because why not? You know, I certainly agree with Zachary. I think one of the most important things we can do is subsidize broadband right now and make sure that people can afford it. I also want to point out, it's really important not to have data caps right now. When we had the Keep Americans Connected pledge, we weren't allowed to do data caps, and that was great, but that pledge is over, and now it's, you know, there's nothing to protect consumers from having that. So if there's a low-income consumer, and a lot of low-income consumers only have cell phones, they can only access the internet through their phone, which you can't use a small data plan to do your homework online and stream your classes and have a parent do a video chat. Like, you cannot do all those things. And so I think that's one thing too that I'd love to see. Maybe let's talk, you know, we'll keep this to like 1 minute each, but long-term solutions, and then we can go on to questions from attendees. What's the one thing or two things, if you really have to, that we would do long-term to just get rid of the digital divide, particularly for marginalized communities? We'll go in the same order again. You did. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So again, I think this is something we need to look at instead of looking at with a shotgun or a hammer, look at it with a surgical instrument. The surgical instrument could be some of the things we've talked about in terms of subsidies. I still think that long-term, the solution that they're doing in Chicago is a big one because it's integrated and it brings in, you know, community-based organizations, philanthropists, government, and industry in order to solve the problems. But I think that the number one thing that you need is research and data to find out so that you can strategically, surgically target where the needs are. That's, I think, in the long term. And whether it's vouchers or whether it's, you know, emergency broadband benefit, we need to get the people who need the help the most, we need to do that immediately.
Quick, short answer is the subsidy for low-income households.
I would say ensuring that the language from the Community Broadband Act that was incorporated into HR 2 that preempts all of the state laws blocking municipal support of broadband networks, making sure that language in HR 2 gets codified and we get as many barriers out of the way as possible for municipalities.
And then for us, it's a little more conceptual. I think if we can move the public discourse, the mainstream opinion, to solidify the fact that broadband is a human right, it's a civil right, that it's essential for everyday life. I think we've made some progress, but if we can codify that, then I think that really gives us a leap towards a long-term solution.
All of those are super helpful. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned, we talked about a little bit earlier on in the webinar, is open access infrastructure. So when we fund infrastructure instead of internet service providers, then multiple providers can come in and they can use that same infrastructure. And that's going to help us in a lot of ways. First of all, it's going to make sure that we have providers giving service in areas that are maybe less profitable because they don't have to invest in that infrastructure themselves. Second of all, is it's going to promote competition, which is going to lower prices, which is going to help low-income individuals actually access broadband. So for my part, in my adding myself as a panelist here, that was one of the things I wanted to remind folks about. And I think, the other thing I want to say is, as a long-term solution, data, we talked about it before, we're going to need more data to understand the problem, data about price, data about how well our networks are working, also data about the speed that folks are experiencing, because right now the FCC is funding, actually, I'm going to add one more thing. The FCC is funding broadband deployment at these 25/3 speeds. That's a pretty slow speed to live your life from home. That's a speed that's going to be outdated by the time these networks are built. So we're investing all of this money in networks that are outdated. If we were to raise that speed and invest in faster networks and in fiber, then we're not essentially like throwing away this money. And we're not going to have to reinvest again, which hopefully can, help keep some prices down. So I'm going to move to the question and answer period. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, go to the bottom. There's a Q&A little button there. So we have one question about broadband research and the census. Oh, okay. So how do we know if we have good data about like that mobile service issue that I talked about with data caps?
Which part?
I don't want to take this. I read that question really badly, but Dagger, you look like you have something you want to say.
Yeah, so about like the census and broadband. Yeah, so I mean, as pretty much everyone knows by now, right? The 2020 census is the first census online. And actually at NHMC, we're working on this issue right now. We see that a lot of the areas that are hard to count are also the ones that don't have access to the internet at home. So we're already seeing a gap in response rates between the 2010 and 2020 census. But, I think that's going to be a really big hurdle if we can't correct that in the next month or so. How are we going to be able to trust that data, not just on population, right, but all of the many questions that kind of come along with the census question?
Thanks. So another question we got is, if there is a standardized, set of criteria or data that we can use to help evaluate digital equity issues, like across projects, and data to help us answer key questions, about all facets of this conversation, like digital equity, digital literacy, devices, et cetera. I think Angela, that's probably
So let me separate out the pieces of the question. So there's data that helps us determine what strategies we need to go after. So that is who doesn't have internet at home, who doesn't have a computer at home, who needs digital literacy support. We can get the broadband adoption data and the computer ownership data off of the American Community Survey, which is census data. The 5-year data is what gets you down to the track level, but still it's better than nothing, because really for most communities, that's all there is. But then there's the data of, okay, well then what's working? And that's more programmatic evaluation data of which programs are doing their job. That's harder to come by because in the past, there hasn't been funding for digital inclusion work. There's no federal money for digital inclusion work, which is terribly wrong. It's been very grassroots. Places like Chicago are able to gather up millions of dollars. How about a small town? What can they gather up? Definitely not millions of dollars. And if they don't have funders like Chicago has, it gets really hard. So we have to, the solutions need to be from the ground up, but some of the funding and resources are going to need to be national and federal.
Another question we have is, this one's from Gregory. So there's technology available and parties willing to help remove the digital divide by creating affordable connectivity. Isn't the local government standing in the way of creating long-term sustainable solutions and new opportunities? So I guess this question is, are local governments actually harming the effort to connect individuals because companies are stepping in and doing it?
Lucas?
I mean, for the short answer, no. A lot of the local governments we work with across the country are quite literally looking for any possible solution available to them. And I think that's something that we try very hard to ingrain in our members when they first come to us and they say, you know, what are we supposed to do? And some of them will come and they'll say, we want a municipal network, or we want an open access backbone, or we want a fully private network. And not every solution is available to every municipality. Like Angela was saying, a small town can't find millions of dollars to suddenly invest in a municipal network. But I know that I personally have heard conversations about, you know, local permitting offices getting in the way of private investment or things like that. And I think it's a very complicated relationship that a municipality and a private provider have to develop. But I think when those relationships sort of flourish is where we see some of the best networks in the country. If you look at some of these open access networks out west, and even here on the East Coast, they are phenomenal examples of, you know, a city council or a town council coming to providers and saying, we want to help however we can, but we understand that we don't have the capacity to deliver the service itself. So I think those relationships are hard and it requires a lot of work from both parties. But I think that local governments are doing everything they can to sort of find the best solution for their people.
I'd like to agree with Lucas as well, but also to say that one thing we could do is to, not all local governments are equal, as we said, and, you know, as Angela said, Chicago is not, you know, I mean, Chicago's got a lot of access and support. So part of it, I think, is sharing some of these ideas and tools, helping them, educating local governments about negotiating, you know, about the existence of the bulk internet, you know, that, you know, they're using as the part of that Connect Chicago initiative, and just having an informed, you know, municipality, you know, I think can do better for its citizens. And I just had one other tiny little thing I wanted to say is on the census thing. I just wanted to make sure that we, you know, let people know that despite, even though we're talking mostly about home broadband, you can fill out your census on your phone in about 2 minutes. So just wanted to make sure
fill out your census. Fill out your census. We're running low on time, but I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. We have a couple good ones. What's the role of Lifeline in the broadband subsidy conversation? I think that's a good question because most people, if they're familiar with the subsidy, it's Lifeline.
Most folks use their Lifeline subsidy for their mobile phone, which has 3 gig of data. I think we can all agree 3 gig of data is not actually broadband. So that means Lifeline, not really a broadband solution for the current subscribers. In some places, there are wireline broadband offers. How good they are widely varies, like in terms of how expensive they are. That's what I meant by good. How expensive they are widely varies because it's only $9.25 off. So NDIA does not view Lifeline as an actual broadband subsidy that is really making a difference.
And then for an HMC, when we're talking about this, you know, any sort of federal broadband subsidy, one thing that has been top of mind for us is that any subsidy or any benefit, any voucher program, as we want to make sure that it doesn't cancel Lifeline out, right? So Angela's absolutely right. Like Lifeline is really not a broadband solution at the moment. But it shouldn't be a case where people have to choose, do I want to use this Lifeline subsidy for my phone, or do I want to sign up for this new one that might or might not give me, the services that I need?
And the other thing I can say about Lifeline is it's really undersubscribed. A lot of eligible individuals for Lifeline don't know about it and haven't subscribed, or haven't subscribed likely because they don't know about it. So we need to do a better job of advertising and telling eligible folks that they're eligible for this. We are over time, so I will let people run. I'll see if we can get some of these questions answered via email. If not, please reach out to myself. Please reach out to the other panelists. We're happy to talk to you more about this and some of the policies for how we can really close the digital divide for marginalized communities. This is so important now more than ever. So, we've had record turnout for this webinar. I think that shows how important this issue is. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to the panelists as well.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.